Since the time of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger's first surprise visit to China in the early 1970s, and Jimmy Carter's normalization of relationships with the People's Republic and denormalization of relations with the Republic of China on Taiwan, there have been the same three pillars of U.S. policy towards China throughout this entire period. One is a sense on the U.S. side that it was better to have China as a potential partner than as a certain enemy. If you think to the Cold War period between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the main U.S. view of the Soviet Union during that time was mainly as an enemy. That if there were areas of partnership, that was fine, but the predominant view was one of adversarial relationship and containment. And the point of the Nixon era opening towards China was, and all through that time, was it was better to think of ways that the countries could work together than not. A second and very important pillar of this relationship through the entire period, I would argue, is a sense that China's growth was on balance good for the United States and the world rather than bad. That is, it is natural in international relations courses and all the rest, or political speeches, to have this zero-sum view, China up, the U.S. down, these charts showing crossing growth paths and all the rest. But the calculation by Nixon and Carter and all since was it was better for the U.S., better for the world, better for everybody if China were prospering, even if eventually its economy would be bigger than America's, than the reverse. That a rich China was better off for the world than a poor and troubled China. The third pillar of this policy for the last several decades has been that despite point one of partnership and point two of growing pie, positive sum, point three was nonetheless the U.S. and China would have fundamental differences that would not go away anytime soon. Differences of international interest in certain instances, differences of political value in many instances, economic disputes of various sorts. And if you look at the history of these two great powers' relationship over this period, you see that the relationship's getting easier and tenser, but within a relatively narrow band. And you also see something very interesting that I encourage you to watch during this American election campaign of 2012, which is that candidates running for office in the United States always emphasize point three, the things we don't like about China. Bill Clinton, when he was running for president in 1992, famously talked about the butchers of Beijing and how they had clamped down on their population during the Tiananmen Square protest of 1989. But Clinton in office was as determined to build a U.S.-China relationship as any other. So that the party that is out always thinks that the U.S. policy is too accommodating. The party that is in always finds ways, at least so far, of having this relationship continue. I could go on about this, and I will if you ask questions, but so point one, the long arc of American policy leading towards Obama's pivot is a relationship that for now almost two generations has been stable, though slightly contradictory. It's been built on potential partnership, recognizing extreme differences and disagreements. And in that way, it's unlike any relationship the U.S. has ever had before. The relationship with the Soviet Union was mainly adversary. The relationship with NATO and European countries has had minor disagreements, but no fundamental ones like those with China. But it's been, from the U.S. perspective, more or less a stable stream, I would argue. Let's think now, point two, about the long arc from the Chinese side, as they think about an American pivot to Asia in the Obama era. I'm going to take, oh, good. Yours, thank you. This is something I've written about a lot. I have a book coming out in about a month called China Airborne that I'm sure you'll all want to buy for the most up-to-date information on all of this. But I would argue that while China's policy, both internally and towards the rest of the world has been, again, a series of sine wave variations, but within a relatively narrow band. And here is what I mean by this. If you had the perspective of being one of the leaders on the State Council in Beijing, or one of the people holding the presidency or premiership or whatever, I think you would view your life as a series of nonstop emergencies, and that your task is to deal with the emergency most immediately at hand and go on to the next one. Is the game of whack-a-mole known in Australia? Whack-a-mole is where these things pop up and you hammer them one after another. I often think of anybody in politics as playing whack-a-mole, but people in Chinese politics are playing a more desperate game of whack-a-mole than most others are. And even though the large arc of the policy has changed from one administration to another, during the time of Jiang Zemin, it was much more sort of rapid industrialization and modernization. In the era that's now ending of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, it's been the so-called harmonious society slogan, which is to try to correct some of the regional imbalances between poor Western China and rich Eastern China, some of the other social imbalances over those, and some of the environmental catastrophes that are befalling China, and in my view are the main problem China has, is the environment. In the last 4 years now, there's been this desperate effort by the Chinese leadership to avoid the world financial collapse, meaning huge millions of people being out of work in China, and there are all sorts of questions about legitimacy of the party and all the rest. Within this perspective, however, of dealing with the emergency, the ever-changing emergency of the moment, I'd say that the view towards the United States has also remained relatively constant and consistent. It's been, if you think of the superego of the Chinese leadership, that is the people who feel they are responsible for the long-term interests of the country and not immediate passions of the moment, not the nationalistic id that comes out of any country's politics from time to time. There's been this constant message that it is good for China to have a stable economic environment, a stable military environment, a stable regional environment. So the calmer things are outside the periphery of China, the fewer additional emergencies that the Chinese leadership has to cope with beyond those that are already consuming as much brain space as they have internally. And this is, while there's been this major theme of stability with the United States being a valuable condition for, that's not my phone, mine is off, so I'm innocent on that. So while they've had this framework of a stable relationship, there's a recognition of some tinderbox type issues that could make real problems between China and the Western world. Taiwan is one of those. The constant fear of Western involvement in some of the splittist issues, as the Chinese government calls them. I'll come to those later on. Let's now, I am pretty sure this is not me. And I will give you the evidence of my Android phone. Now, I thought it had turned it off. It was. So this I'm taking accountability for okay, power off. You see the symbol saying power off and off. Okay, there we go. So those are the two long arc points. Now let's talk more. Let's move this more to the present time with the beginning of the Obama era and how these two sort of long wave trends are affecting the decisions that President Obama made when he came in. We're going to talk about the view towards Asia from the perspective of Washington, D.C., of the new president who took office a little more than 3 years ago. It's worth remembering, even though you all may have been too young to be paying attention at the time, that the issues Barack Obama ran for when he was coming to office have almost nothing to do with the problems he's had to deal with in office. He first came to national attention in the 2004 Democratic convention in Boston, where I had the good fortune to be sitting there watching him speak. At the time, he wasn't even in the U.S. Senate then. He was running for the U.S. Senate against a crazy man named Alan Keyes. And if you think I'm being disrespectful, you can go look up one of their debates sometime. And Barack Obama came to national attention with a famous speech. This was during a lot of the bitter division in the George W. Bush administration, saying, we're not red states of America, we're not blue states of America, we're the United States of America, and appealing to a sense of unity that had been very severely tested by a lot of the political extremes of the Bush years. The Iraq War was just getting underway. Barack Obama, over the next 4 years, he began running for president almost immediately once he reached the U.S. Senate. His main stated reason for running for president involved the Iraq War. And Hillary Clinton, who would have been the presumptive, most natural Democratic nominee for president in 2008, had voted for the Iraq War as a member of the U.S. Senate. Barack Obama, as a state politician in Illinois, had given a speech against the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003. He was in the relative minority of people saying things that I also and other people were writing in the press, saying this was a big mistake. This was the wrong kind of war. It wasn't going to work out. It was going to do more harm than good, etc. So he was known for talking about unity in the American public, for talking about the Iraq War, for talking about the rule of law, and for symbolizing a step forward of the centuries of America's black-white division, of being the first non-white serious candidate for president of the United States, and of course the first non-white president ever to win that office. What happened when a man whose whole life experience was in legal issues, he was a law professor at the University of Chicago, whose political identity was about foreign policy on the Iraq War, and whose main argument was about domestic knitting together, or he won the election against John McCain, the world's financial house collapsed all around him. And he suddenly realized that even though it looked like he was likely to win, he was going to win in an entirely different environment than anybody had imagined even 6 months earlier. And so if you read now the early histories of Barack Obama's first year in office, he felt himself like some of those financial and political leaders in 1929 and 1930, when nobody knew how complete the collapse was going to be. So his number one emergency was avoiding world depression. His number two emergency was trying to get his health care plan through the Congress, something that Democratic presidents for 50 years had tried to do and had been defeated. His number three priority was this giant wave of unemployment, which is always the worst political problem in a democracy. Then there was this decision about what to do in Afghanistan. Afghanistan he had called a good war in opposition to the bad war of Iraq. And next on the whack-a-mole hierarchy was dealing with the Republican Party, which had decided that its strategy was just to oppose anything he did and to filibuster his proposals, et cetera, et cetera. So a man who had run on an entirely different set of policies suddenly was dealing with issues he was not prepared for, the world was not prepared for, and other things like deal openings to the Arab world or dealing with the Pacific just got kind of shoved aside. It's worth recognizing. So I mean, the analogy would be you've crammed for a physics test and you walk into the room and it's a test on fine art. You know, essentially that's the situation Barack Obama was in. The stuff of many student-era nightmares that I recall so well. This natural crowding out phenomenon of a president who was so beset by the real emergencies of the moment that he had not foreseen, I think was perceived by many in Asia as it was misperceived by many in Asia in two ways. One was as the precursor of thoroughgoing American collapse. We'd heard about it for a long time. Now it was happening for real. The Americans were finally entering the ash heap of history, as Khrushchev had promised, and Castro and all the rest. And the Chinese, I was living in China through this time, there was a fair amount of this from the Chinese press. The related point would be a sense of of attention moving away from the Pacific and from Asia. The United States had a very important military relationship over the years with Japan, with South Korea, in various ways with ASEAN countries, of course with Australia, not recently with New Zealand because of differences on nuclear policies, and of course its ongoing relationship with China. But these were moving down the bottom of the priority list. And does any of you remember the coverage of Obama's trip to China in 2009 after he'd been in office for less than a year? At least in the United States, the coverage was like the humiliating pilgrimage of a beggar vassal to his new paymasters. Because the Chinese economy was beginning to recover then because of a huge stimulus effort by the Chinese government. Obama was going there and was not lecturing Hu Jintao about human rights. He was not giving the Chinese government a hard time. And the perspective from the US press at least was, boy, America is weak, Obama is weak, China is number one. There was a lot of that discussion, I think, in the Australian press as well, and the sense that the balance of power really had shifted. I don't think, as I'll try to tell you in a moment, the shift was really as profound as that, but that it was the perceptual prelude. So from the Obama administration, I'm nearing the end of this point 3, they were swamped by other concerns, and the Asian policy, I'm going to tell you in a minute, was going on in a sort of subterranean way, but it wasn't apparent, it wasn't leading the news. Now, next on this list of, this is the 4th of 5 items I'm going to talk about, is how the Obama era developments seem from the Chinese side and from the rest of Asian side, which is going to lead us then to the 5th point, which is about the pivot and its implications. I think there was, especially in 2009 and early 2010, a sense radiating from Beijing of China really having solved modern problems in a way that the rest of the world was still buffaloed by. The Chinese stimulus was larger and more aggressive and more rapidly successful than was the case in Europe or the United States. I go traveling in Western China in the middle of 2009, and practically any kilometer of road you were on had 200 rural people shoveling sand onto it or laying bricks or whatever. There's a way of keeping people employed despite the manufacturing and exporting slowdown. There was also within some of the Chinese leadership sphere a sense of them believing their own publicity a little bit too much. And on the part of the People's Liberation Army, some forays in the South China Sea, some rhetorical excesses by some of China's diplomats about where its natural and intrinsic interests lay throughout Asia that caused a somewhat alarmed reaction in Australia, in Japan, in Korea, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in many of the countries on China's periphery, in the Philippines. And although the U.S. did not feel, the U.S. government did not feel that it had really changed its policy in any profound or weakening way, there was a sense that it seemed to have done so, and that many of the other countries in the Pacific felt as if the U.S. was becoming a shadow of its previous self, and it was no longer strong enough to deal with the rising power of China. So I think this meanwhile, and we'll talk about this later if you want, I think there's been some increasing nervousness within the Chinese state over the last year or so about the fragility of its economic rise, about some of the political tensions that the Arab Spring might have symbolized and all the rest. What we had on the Chinese side in 2009 and 2010, a little bit of excessive confidence with a resulting air of apprehension in some of the rest of the Pacific, and that leads to point 5 of the pivot. Starting about a year ago, the time that Hu Jintao came to Washington, D.C. for a state visit, which my wife and I had the very good fortune of getting to attend. So we got to go sit in this dinner with Hu Jintao and Barack Obama, and I think most of the people who came to this visit, it was interesting to see an American president and his wife in the flesh, but many people who have been involved in American politics have done that. You almost never see a Chinese president up close and in real life. Mrs. Hu was not there, but Hu Jintao was there, and he made English brief chat with everybody as they went through the receiving line. But there was a sense of the United States trying to reassert the combined messages of its long-term Asian policy, which were partnership with China and welcoming its rise, but also asserting the areas of disagreement. You heard Hillary Clinton giving her speech about freedom of communication and the Google showdown with China. You had the U.S. Navy leading the U.S. military and having interactions with the Chinese military and saying, yes, we're going to be present in this part of the world. You had exercises with many of the surrounding nations of China, but by the U.S., trying to re-establish not a containment policy, I would argue, not a new policy, not an exclusion of Europe or the Middle East or all the other areas of Western engagement, but essentially re-establishing the complex and contradictory balance that for 30 plus years has created conditions for China's prosperity, for relative peace within East Asia, and for a more dynamic era in world economy than we've seen before. So I could say more about all these, but let me just say sort of 30 seconds to wrap it up. What I think you should, rather than looking for radical changes one way or another in American policy towards the Pacific, engagement, disengagement, interest, lack of interest, infatuation, hostility, I think it's worth seeing this span of your entire lifetimes and most of your parents' lifetimes as being surprising constancy between the United States and this part of the world. There are some enduring political alliances with Australia, of course, with many of the democracies of ASEAN, with Japan, with South Korea. There are military connections which have remained in place, and there is, I think, a complex but basically stable relationship with China. You can imagine things that would upset it. You could imagine, again, shocks involving Taiwan. You could imagine shocks involving North Korea. You could imagine some environmental shock, which may be the highest on that list. You can imagine the tumult that will affect China as it grows. But the main point I leave you with is that you should recognize that Australia's diplomats and leaders and military officials and thinkers, in concert with those on the eastern side of the Pacific in North America and on the western and northern side of the Pacific in Northeast Asia, have together done something impressive in managing stably an enormous shift in world economic and military power. To have China grow as fast as it has with as few ripples and military consequences as we have endured in the last 40 years is a remarkable thing. And so it's worth, I think, studying this so far as a success case and seeing what can be applied for future lessons. I will stop there to have our colloquy. If I entirely contradict what you heard last week, sorry, I wasn't here, but it'll give you more to discuss, and now we'll explore other aspects.
Talk about pretty high table here, isn't it? Okay, so I'd like to ask three broad sets of questions, I think. Most analysts will say that the pivot has these three different dimensions. There's a political dimension, there's an economic dimension, and there's also a military dimension. So I'd just like to start with the political, and we could talk about...
Taking notes.
Sure. And we could talk about APEC, or the East Asian Summit, but let's talk about something which is going to huge change at the moment. That's Burma. So, for those of you who have been keeping track of what's going on in Burma, American policy towards Burma has been changing very rapidly over the last few months. So 18 months ago, it would have been unthinkable to have Secretary of State Hillary Clinton travelling to Burma and embracing Aung San Suu Kyi. And I'd just like to see how how is Burma playing out within the context of the American-China rivalry? We can see this, the changing of Burma happening because of internal dynamics. Is it because the Burmese are becoming afraid of becoming too dependent upon the Chinese and therefore they're trying to open up to the rest of the world? Or are they becoming seduced by the American? Are they running towards America or running away from China? Is it better to be Western Germany rather than Eastern Germany?
How many people here have been in Burma? It is a phenomenally interesting and until very recently heartbreaking country. I was there with my wife during the riots of 1988 when a lot of people were murdered by the regime, and been back there a few times since. It has been, it's potentially a very, very rich country in its natural resources, and there's a kind of gentleness to a lot of the culture there, but it's been very, very badly ruled. It's sort of North Korea without nuclear weapons and without the thoroughgoingness of the repression and oddity. Although just as a diversion, as a symbol of the oddity, when we were there in '88, part of what had triggered the uprisings in Burma then was that all the existing currency was ruled worthless, so people's life savings were instantly taken away, and new currency was issued on a base 15 numbering system. So you have bills that are worth 45 chat and 75 chat, and it's surprisingly hard to do math in base 15, but there you go. I think that the perception has been that the reason for the change in U.S. policy is a dramatic change inside Burma. That until very recently, the Burmese military seemed resistant to any of the liberalization requests from the West. And Aung San Suu Kyi, on the one hand, wasn't murdered, but on the other hand, she was under house arrest. And so I think in the last year plus, there's been signs that the military regime has been willing to open. And my best understanding, although imperfect, is that this has been in fear of remaining, because the Western world had largely had a boycott against Burma, its only trading partner was China. And this was because China had its policy of non-interference and non-judgmentalism about other regimes. And so this made, I think, Burma more obviously a Chinese pawn than it seemed to be an advantage. It would be better in the long run to be in the ASEAN position, which they are now part of having both alliances to North America, to Europe, and to Asia. So my guess would be that among the forces propelling the opening in Burma has been a Burmese desire to have alternatives to Chinese hegemony there. And certainly the American embrace of Burma has followed the opening in Burma rather than the other way around. It's not as if the Americans were still being more or less standoffish and having to boycott, and then Burma began to open, and now we have this an attempted opening and integration that I think will be good for everybody if it goes forward.
So then switch to the economic dimension and talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so how do you read the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Do you see this as being a Burma policy towards liberalisation, that things in Europe have gone south, the Doha round is dead, and so just being pragmatic that the way towards global liberalisation is through some sort of partnership, and the best or the most attractive part will be the Asia Pacific. These Asia Pacific seems to be most open towards trade liberalisation. Alternatively, you can see this as just geopolitics, that this is a way of the United States lining up states against China, that China hasn't been invited yet, whereas it's all the usual suspects: Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Philippines, Australia, Chile. They're all the usual suspects who are lining up potentially against China, are joining, have been invited to join the discussions for the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Anything worthwhile in life has a variety of motivations and causations, so I'm sure those factors and others are behind it. But I would say it's mainly the first. It's mainly the ongoing agenda of trade liberalization. I mentioned earlier that every presidential candidate runs against China when they're not in office. Once they become president, they work out relations with China. So too on trade relations. Every party that's out of office criticizes trade agreements with other parts of the world. Every incumbent president finds ways to expand them because in office they're convinced by the logic that a steadily growing trade regime is finally in the overall security and economic interest of the United States and most of its allied partners. So I think this is mainly that momentum, and certainly the Asian economies look more promising overall than the European now, but there simultaneously have been agreements with Latin American countries and all the rest. So I think that this is mainly that part of the agenda, and if it's another reminder that the U.S. is also in Asia, it's not just China in Asia, then that's a sort of extra bonus. But I think it's more a continuity of several decades worth of continued trade agreements than it is some clever, let's box in the Chinese ploy.
And the third dimension is the military dimension, which is getting the most play, but it's probably, when you look at what's actually happening, the least significant. Last week, news was released from the International Institute for Strategic Studies that this year Asia will spend more on defence than Europe for the first time since the Institute has been keeping records. So is the American military build-up, as it is in Asia, sufficient? We've got the announcements that have been announced so far include 2,500 troops going to Darwin. We have the stationing of littoral ships in Singapore, and there's going to be the build-up on Guam as well. Most of that is just going to be transfer of troops from Okinawa. So is this sufficient? Is the United States keeping pace? Does it need to keep pace? How do you read the military dimension of the pivot?
Sufficient is an interesting adjective to apply there. I will start by saying, is it sensible or logical? And I think it is logical. Let's think about why the U.S. has troops in this part of the world to start with, given that there is a relatively low level of ongoing combat here compared with other parts of the world, notably Central Asia. May have lost, there we go, just reposition this. The reason why there are tens of thousands of troops in South Korea and on Japan and just afloat is through naval resources is the idea, number one, that it is a stabilizing influence for all major parties, including the Japanese, the Chinese, although it's hard for them to say that, Southeast Asian countries and the Korean Peninsula, to have some buffering factor by a distant power. That nobody, in the abstract, nobody would really prefer to have U.S. troops around, but their presence makes it harder for either Japan, China, one of the Koreas, etc., to have a local monopoly, which could be even more upsetting in various ways. It also has been, for the U.S., a deployment area to have people ready for staging a deployment area for other parts of the world. Over the last decade, there's been a genuine aberration in American troop presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, of many tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of troops in those countries. That was never intended to be a permanent deployment, and so I think there is a sense, from the U.S. point of view, that for stabilizing and sort of forward staging reasons, it's worth having some troops in Europe and some troops in the Pacific, mainly just as reminders of open sea lanes and all the rest. Two answers on the sufficient part. First, I am a genuine dove when it comes to the Chinese military menace. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy is about to have its first aircraft carrier deployed. Who knows in what decade the United States had its first aircraft carrier? The answer is the 1920s was the first aircraft carrier for the United States Navy. It takes years and years and years to train, naval operations and all the rest. So simply having a ship is a long way away from having a capacity, and the gap between the Chinese military and other militaries is still very, very large. I also think that a surprising force for peace in this part of the world has been the U.S. Navy, and here's what I mean. The U.S. Navy has taken upon itself to open a charm offensive with the People's Liberation Army. That the U.S. Navy is always trying to have these exchanges with PLA officials, bringing admirals and generals to the U.S., sending U.S. admirals and generals to China, trying to have person-to-person familiarity between these two militaries. And so they've done as much of that as any other part of the U.S. government. I think that is a force for stability rather than mutual suspicion. So that doesn't answer your question directly, but I don't worry about the military balance here, I guess is my answer.
Sure. So you're looking at these, during your introductory lecture, there were these three constant traditions of American policy towards China. The final one was there's this constant friction over certain different issues. Of those issues, what would you rank as the most dangerous or the most likely to lead to some sort of competition in the future?
There's a very interesting, because dangerous and likely, as you know, would be two different categories. The most dangerous issue by far, in my view, involves Taiwan, in the sense that this is not likely but potentially dangerous. It's not likely because basically all parties to the arrangement, that is to say, the mainland, the PRC government and mainland China's population, the Taiwanese government and Taiwan's people, the American government, the American population, they all have more or less an interest in things as they are going on now. If you've been to southern China, a huge number of the factories are Taiwanese owned or managed or operated. There's now direct flights back and forth. So there's increasing just kind of business as usual between these countries. And so if nothing rocks the boat, you have a relatively calm relationship. But the problem is that in reality, things work fine. In principle, there is fundamental disagreement among all the three parties, that the PRC government and the Republic of China government do not agree on what the political relationships are between them. The United States government deliberately turns its eyes away from this whole situation and says, well, we agree there's one China, and we're going to leave it at that. And I think that the population of the PRC completely disagrees with the population of the United States on the merits of this issue. I think that my impression within China is that virtually everybody agrees that American military sales to Taiwan are a complete sort of irritant and almost revolutionary insurrectionist thing to do, and need to be stopped at some point. The U.S. population generally thinks this is part of the agreement struck with Taiwan in 1978 and 79, and part of Taiwan's self-defense. And so if it's ever raised to a point of principle, you could have real disagreement. And so if there were a declaration of independence from Taiwan, that could be quite dangerous. The most likely disagreement, I think, might involve either a flashpoint of Iran, North Korea, something where the U.S. thinks that China should do something different from what China thinks it should do, or some environmental nightmare where each country starts blaming the other. So I think economic disputes can largely be contained, but maybe one of those things.
We just mentioned Iran, and I think I might finish on that note, because you've written widely on options for dealing with Iran. And I just want to put this into sort of a bit of context with China as well. I know you think that an attack on Iran is silly and highly unlikely to occur, but how does the relationship between Iran, the United States, and China play out?
First, I'm going to poll audience opinion here. I'm going to force you to do something you don't want to do, which is to choose between two oversimplified options. You're going to have to choose one or the other. And the two oversimplified options are Iran eventually develops nuclear weapons, and Iran is therefore contained the way North Korea is contained, Pakistan is contained, or there is a preemptive strike on Iran to prevent that, either by Israel or the United States. Now, my preference is neither of those, but I'm not going to let you have that preference. So I'm going to make you choose one or the other. If you think that if between Iran eventually getting nuclear weapons and attacking Iran, okay, you think better just to have, accept that Iran is going to get nuclear weapons and we'll deal with them like other countries. How many favor that? How many think no, it'd be better to attack them if they get on the verge? So interesting, I'd say like 60-40, maybe 65-35 on the containment strategy. I think that this situation epitomizes what will be an increasing series of awkward situations for the Chinese government. Until recently, the Chinese government could say, number one, our policy is non-interference, non-intervention. We don't tell other people how to live, you don't tell us how to live. And so we're going to deal with Sudan, we're going to deal with North Korea. That's not our problem, and our domestic affairs are not your problem too. So that was easy for them to carry out. They have now reached a size where I think they can't get away with that anymore. When you're the second largest economy in the world and a huge strategic force, you can't say, hey, not my problem. And so I think it was very awkward for the Chinese government to have this Syrian showdown in the United Nations where Russia and China together had to veto a resolution condemning Syria. And they were, I think if Russia had been peeled off, the Chinese would have found that position untenable too. I think they don't want to be in a position of being the outlier, of being the only one supporting Iran, the only one supporting Burma, the only one supporting X or Y. And so the strategy from the Western side will be separating Russia from China on these issues, I think. And I think that China will not take the lead on some containment efforts against Iran, but if the choice is standing behind the Iranian regime and being isolated as the only person doing that, their relationships with the rest of the world are more important than their relationships with Iran, I believe. So I think the pressure, part of the multi-front strategy that Western nations are applying now involving Iran is also on China, and to have them be swung into this configuration, I think.
I've surrendered my microphone, so there's going to be two mics now. Just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Got one here. In the middle.
It's not so much a question, but just your opinion on what happened with Daisey and Foxconn.
So the question involves Mike Daisey and Foxconn. I will stand up to address this. How many of you already know all about this story? Okay, so the background is Mike Daisey is a monologuist, a performance artist in the United States. There was an amusing article on the internet yesterday saying that he was married to my wife. This is not actually true. It's on the internet, so it must be true. But you can, if you go to my website, which is jamesfallows.com, you'll see the story of the allegations that he's married to my wife. And my wife, whose maiden name was Deborah Derad, she's presented in the same article as being a native of China, which also is not true. But so Mike Daisey is a performance artist whose specialty is long narratives about social problems that he has explored. And one of them that has gotten a lot of attention in recent years is something called The Agony and the Ecstasy of Steve Jobs. And in this, Mike Daisey presents himself as having been fascinated by the iPad. I hold for your inspection the iPad and the iPhone. This is actually an Android phone, but bear with me. And the MacBook Air, which I have one of, and some of you do here too. And so he said he wanted to know where these things came from and what the whole connection was between the world's sweatshop production chain that led to these marvelous objects, but at what human price were they being evoked? So part of his performance, The Agony and the Ecstasy of Steve Jobs, talks about he goes to Hong Kong. He presents himself as a loud American businessman in the supply chain industry. He wears a Hawaiian shirt and a bow tie to make himself seem like some American Yahoo. He hires a translator and he goes to Foxconn to say, okay, how do these things come from? And he has this gripping narrative about going to the Foxconn gates. Foxconn, the world's biggest production factory. Their factory in Shenzhen, which I have seen, had at its peak 400,000 workers in one place. It was about the size of the Los Angeles International Airport. If any of you have seen that, it's a huge place. So Daisey talked about seeing the workers pour in through the gates, past these guards carrying automatic weapons, and how many of the people coming in through the gates told them they were 12 years old and 13 years old, and how he talked to a man who had been crippled and poisoned by hexane gas when making an iPad. And there's this dramatic scene where Mike Daisey shows him an iPad, says the man, these are my notes if you can read them up close, said the man had never before actually seen the magical object he had created. And with his clawed and crippled hand from the Apple production site, he went across the icons. And Mike Daisey, through his translator, said, "What is he saying?" And then the man said, "It's a kind of magic, isn't it?" And to bring this, to sort of jump to the end of the story, he's making this all up. When I first heard this narrative, which has been enormously successful and influential in the United States, Mike Daisey has written op-ed pieces for the New York Times when Steve Jobs died, saying, yes, Steve Jobs was great, but I saw the people he crippled in China. He's been on C-SPAN, which is our public affairs network. Anybody who actually had seen the Apple production facilities in China, who had been to Foxconn factories, as I had, most reporters had, said, this just doesn't sound right. The guards don't carry automatic weapons. They look like your normal rent-a-cop wearing their little security suits. And there are lots of problems in these factories, but you don't see 12-year-olds there. You see people who might be 17, but it's harsh work, but that's one of the things they do avoid. And the hexane gas, that was actually in a factory in Changsha. That wasn't a factory in Shenzhen. And so a reporter based in Shanghai for National Public Radio, for American Public Radio's Marketplace, went back and he found the translator for Mike Daisey. And he asked her about all this. He said, oh no, none of this ever happened. That we talked to a couple of people and nobody said they were 12, and no, we didn't have this guy with a crippled hand and all the rest. And so there was an expose this past weekend on a show called This American Life, which is a very influential radio show in the US. And it is absolutely gripping radio to hear it, because Ira Glass, who is the host of this program, and a kind of Edward R. Murrow / Bono hybrid in American radio, was saying, you lied to me. And Mike Daisey is saying, well, in the context of the performance, it was true. And so I think that the point here is, if this had been presented as a dramatization, if he had said, Charles Dickens never saw Oliver Twist, but Charles Dickens imagined Oliver Twist. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin about slavery in the United States, she didn't see people being whipped, but she knew about people being whipped. And she was able to imagine this. If he had done it, if he had said it was a dramatization, it would have had 99% of the impact. But he was presenting it as documentary truth. And he is now fighting back somewhat, saying, well, it was true in the context of performance and all that. But I think it is, the tragedy of this is, there are two tragedies. One is, there's a genuine workplace safety issue in China, as you all know. Foreign-owned factories like Apple are not the worst part of it at all, but there's a real workplace safety crisis in China. One data point, when I was in Beijing in 2007, there was a little tiny story in a Chinese newspaper that got no foreign pickup at all, except for something I wrote saying that the previous day, 32 workers in a Chinese factory had been boiled to death when a ladle full of molten steel slipped off its hoist and fell over them. This is workplace safety. This is the kind of thing which happened, in England or the US 100 years ago, but is part of China's rough and ready industrialization. And because of this episode, a lot of these concerns are being minimized now, because people can say, oh, well, the guy just made it up. Also, within China, it's tools for the officials who can say, oh, these foreigners don't make up anything. They'll believe anything. And so it's really an unfortunate episode, but it's worth looking up, including the bigamy story about my wife being married both to me and to Mike Daisey. So that's a long answer to the Mike Daisey question. Now I will sit down again.
Hi, sorry, a somewhat maybe relevant question to this topic, but how did you become a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter?
The same way most people do in politics, in American politics, and I think Australia too, I'd imagine, which is by accident. So when I started working for Jimmy Carter, I was 25 and 26. When I was in the White House, I was 26 and 27 and 28, and that's not unusual. And the reason is, when people are starting their campaigns for president, almost all of them are going to fail. Now, you've seen the primaries going on now with Santorum and Gingrich, and remember back to Rick Perry and John Huntsman and Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann and Newt Gingrich and all these people and Mitt Romney. They all have staffs. And for most of these candidates, it's going to be a couple-month adventure that leads nowhere. And so the people who sign on with them are mainly young people who have nothing to lose and who have no fixed jobs, they have no family responsibilities. And so in my case, I had been out of graduate school for 2 years. And I was working for a little magazine in Washington, D.C. called the Washington Monthly. That's my first journalism job. Then my wife and I, or as we refer to her, Mrs. Daisey, were down in Texas when she was starting graduate school in linguistics, and I was working just as a kind of startup freelance writer, writing some things about politics, and I had some friends who said they were signing on with the Jimmy Carter campaign, and was I interested in trying it too. And I liked the sound of what he was doing, so I thought, why not? So I moved off from Austin, Texas. I moved to Americus, Georgia, which is this little hellhole in the southern U.S., living in a motel with another guy who was my roommate, and my wife was staying back in graduate school in Texas. And so over the next 6 months or so, that campaign got momentum, and Carter won the nomination, and then it really got momentum, and there was an actual airplane we traveled around, and just barely he beat Gerald Ford, who was the incumbent president. Carter was way ahead at the time of the nomination, and the gap got smaller every single day. And if the campaign had gone on 2 or 3 more weeks, we might have lost, but it didn't. So Carter won. I stayed then for the guy who had been my boss in the campaign got into a disagreement with Carter and left. So I became the head speechwriter and did that for 2 years, and then just had enough and left. So if you have an opportunity to do this kind of thing, it's worth doing when you're young. Speechwriters should be young because it is very hard and somewhat humiliating work. And so it's something it's better to do while you're in that 20-something frame of mind.